This founder never wanted to be a businessman. He forged climbing gear by hand, lived out of his van, and tried to escape capitalism altogether before building one of the most beloved outdoor companies in the world. Meet Yvon Chouinard. He didn't follow trends, he ran from them. What began as a blacksmith's passion project turned into Patagonia, a brand built on rebellion, responsibility, and radical transparency. But how does someone who despises corporate culture end up creating a billion-dollar business and then give it all away? Can a company thrive without selling its soul? This is the story of a climber who never wanted to lead, but changed the business world by doing it his way. Yvon Chouinard was never drawn to the comforts of modern life. He was born in 1938 in Lewiston, Maine, to French-Canadian immigrants. His father was a hard-working craftsman, a man who shaped metal and wood with his hands, who taught Yvon how to fix what was broken and make what didn't exist. When the family moved to Southern California in search of better opportunities, it wasn't the sun or sand that captivated Yvon. It was the cliffs, the silence, the vertical unknown. He found a kind of freedom in rock climbing that the modern world couldn't offer. No traffic, no rules, no expectations, just risk, rope, and granite. But there was one problem. The gear was terrible. In the 1950s, American climbers were still using soft steel pitons from Europe. They bent too easily, got stuck in the rock, and couldn't be reused. For someone climbing on a budget and a mission, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. So Chouinard did what no one else dared to. He learned blacksmithing. He set up a makeshift forge in his parents' backyard, scavenged old tools and scrap metal, and began hammering out his own pitons. Harder, sharper, reusable. He sold them out of the back of his car in Yosemite's Camp 4, the unspoken capital of American climbing. Word spread. Soon, Chouinard Equipment was born. Not a company in the traditional sense, but more like a movement of climbers, rebels, and makers who believed that if they were going to risk their lives on the wall, the gear had to be worthy. Yvon wasn't alone in this. One of the earliest and most crucial collaborators was Tom Frost, an engineer and fellow climber who joined Yvon in the late 50s. Together, they didn't just make gear, they innovated it. Frost brought precision, discipline, and design thinking. Yvon brought instinct, feel, and a willingness to break convention. They worked out of a small tin shed in Ventura, California. It was dirty, loud, chaotic, but every tool, every idea, every mistake was a step towards something new. Their gear soon became the gold standard in the climbing world. They weren't just making equipment anymore. They were redefining what it meant to climb clean, to leave no trace, to respect the mountains. Then, something unexpected happened. In the early 1970s, while on a climbing trip to Scotland, Yvon picked up a rugby shirt from a thrift shop. It was tough, simple, and had a collar that protected his neck from gear slings. Back in the US, climbers kept asking where he got it. So he ordered more, dyed them in bold colors, and sold them under a new name, Patagonia. He had no fashion background, no market research, just a feeling that people like him, people who lived outside, pushed boundaries, and hated the artificial, wanted something different, something real. And they did. The first Patagonia catalog read more like a manifesto than a product list. It spoke about function, sustainability, beauty, not trends. Each product had a purpose. Each photo was shot in the wild. There was no pretense, no manipulation. Just gear made by people who used it. In those early days, the team was small but devoted. Yvon often hired surfers, climbers, and ski bums, people who understood the customer because they were the customer. There was a sense of shared identity, of building something bigger than a business. Employees were encouraged to take off work when the surf was good. Kids ran around the office. Dogs slept under desks. It was chaotic, human, and alive. Chouinard didn't want growth for growth's sake. But Patagonia began to grow anyway, not because it chased profit, but because it stood for something, because it made better things, told honest stories, and treated people and the planet with uncommon respect. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize those early years, but they were full of tension too. Between Yvon's anti-corporate instincts and the realities of scaling a business, between doing what felt right and doing what the market expected. Still, there was a belief, quiet but powerful, that they were on the edge of something new. A way of building a company that could succeed because it stood for more. Yvon once said, "I've been a businessman for almost 60 years. It's as close to being a fugitive as you can get." That tension between wildness and structure, values and velocity, was always there. And soon, it would come to a head. But success, as it often does, brought new pressure. The bigger Patagonia became, the harder it was to hold on to the soul that started it all. And the question loomed, could they keep climbing without losing their grip? For a time, Patagonia seemed untouchable, a company built on principle, flourishing in a world that often rewarded the opposite. But beneath the surface of its values-driven brand, there were tensions. Quiet ones, slow building. The kind that don't erupt all at once, but unravel everything, one quiet compromise at a time. Yvon Chouinard never wanted to grow Patagonia into a giant, but growth came anyway. By the late 1990s, the company had expanded well beyond its climbing roots. It had become a global player, stocked in malls, worn by millions, debated in boardrooms. The very system Yvon had tried to subvert now looked more and more like the one he was a part of. Inside the company, that tension was real. Patagonia's original team, the dirtbags, the purists, the ones who started with a forge and a vision, began to feel the pressure. Product timelines accelerated. Supply chains stretched across continents. The more they grew, the harder it became to source materials that aligned with their values. There were no perfect choices anymore, only trade-offs. And in 1991, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Sales had plateaued. Inventory had piled up. A recession tightened consumer spending, and Patagonia, which had always resisted conventional marketing, was unprepared. Suddenly, the company that prided itself on doing things differently was staring down layoffs and debt. Yvon later reflected on that year as a personal failure. "We were growing for the sake of growing," he admitted, "and we nearly lost what made us different." The wake-up call forced a kind of reckoning, but even as the company doubled down on its environmental mission, the balance was delicate. Patagonia was becoming a brand, and with that came expectations, not just from customers, but from a rising generation of employees who demanded more than ideals. Internally, some began to question the company's real impact. Were recycled fabrics and fair trade labels enough? Could any apparel company, no matter how ethical, truly call itself sustainable while making new products? These weren't surface-level critiques. They came from within, from early employees, former partners, even Chouinard's own children. As Patagonia's presence grew, so did its contradictions. One former executive, speaking anonymously, said, "We were preaching anti-consumerism while hitting quarterly sales targets." That contradiction was hard to ignore after a while. Others pointed to the brand's cult status, how it had become a symbol of virtue among elites, worn in tech boardrooms and luxury airports. Patagonia fleece became shorthand for responsible capitalism. But it also masked the unease that came with scale. Externally, Patagonia faced new scrutiny. Environmental groups questioned whether its supply chains were as clean as advertised. Labor activists challenged its overseas manufacturing. Critics asked, if Patagonia really wanted to change the world, why not stop selling altogether? And then came the controversy around Chouinard Equipment, the original climbing gear company Yvon had founded decades earlier. While Patagonia, the apparel company, had distanced itself from Chouinard Equipment in the late 80s, the legacy remained. In 1996, after a tragic accident linked to one of its climbing products, Chouinard Equipment, by then a separate entity, was forced into bankruptcy under a cloud of liability. The event cast a long shadow. It was a sobering reminder. Even with the best intentions, things break. People get hurt. And the name you build can follow you, even after you let it go. Yvon was never implicated directly, but the emotional toll was deep. Friends left the industry. Lawsuits dragged on. For a man who had once believed that craftsmanship could save lives, the moment was devastating. Back at Patagonia, the tension didn't explode. It simmered. Year after year, the brand grew more respected, more profitable, more admired. But that admiration came with scrutiny. Each campaign, from "Don't buy this jacket" to lawsuits against the Trump administration, was both celebrated and questioned. Were they bold acts of corporate rebellion or brilliant marketing? Yvon, by then in his 70s, seemed increasingly disillusioned. He spent less time in meetings, more time in the wilderness. In interviews, he sounded weary. "I never wanted a company," he said. "I just wanted to climb." The people around him carried the mission forward. They improved factories. They cleaned up the supply chain. They fought legal battles for public lands. But even they knew perfection was impossible. The company had become a paradox, a business against business, a brand that stood for minimalism by selling more, a beacon of ethics, still reliant on the same global systems it tried to reform. And yet, despite all of this, Patagonia endured. Not because it had no flaws, but because it never pretended it didn't. It acknowledged them, wrestled with them, publicly, painfully, often imperfectly. That vulnerability became its strength. But for Yvon, the question remained: how do you keep your soul when the thing you built starts to take on a life of its own? By 2022, Chouinard made a decision that shocked the world. A final act, not of failure, but of release. But before we get there, we have to understand what it meant for a founder to finally let go. In the end, Yvon Chouinard did what few founders ever do. He gave it all away. In 2022, at age 83, he announced that Patagonia, the billion-dollar company he never wanted to build, would no longer belong to him or his family. Instead, it would be placed in a trust and a nonprofit. Every dollar not reinvested in the business would go toward protecting the planet. No fanfare, no IPO, just a quiet press release that read, "Earth is now our only shareholder." It was a decision decades in the making, a final radical gesture in a life defined by resisting the obvious path. And in that moment, the contradictions of Chouinard's journey came into sharper focus, not as failures, but as proof that vision doesn't need to be flawless to matter. He had started with forged pitons and a deep love of the wild. Along the way, he built a global brand, stumbled into capitalism, questioned his own role in it, and ultimately tried to return to something simpler, something that felt like truth. But what did it all mean? Patagonia didn't solve climate change. It didn't end consumerism. It didn't reinvent business as we know it. The supply chains remained complex. The paradoxes remained intact. And yet, something shifted. Chouinard didn't just make better jackets. He made business itself a kind of question. What if profit wasn't the point? What if growth wasn't the measure? What if companies could protect what they so often destroy? The answers weren't always clear, but the asking mattered. Patagonia's impact can't be measured only in sales or savings. It lives on, in the brands that now question their own footprint, in the employees who ask for purpose, not just perks, in the consumers who think twice before they buy. It lives on in the uncomfortable idea that success doesn't have to mean more, that it can sometimes mean less. For those who followed Chouinard's journey, there are lessons but no blueprints. His path wasn't linear. It was jagged, human, full of missteps and course corrections. It was proof that ideals don't always survive contact with reality, but they can evolve with it. And that evolution is the legacy, not the perfect execution of a perfect company, but the relentless refusal to settle for less than meaning. Yvon once said, "If you want to understand the entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent." The delinquent is saying with his actions, "This sucks. I'm going to do it my own way." That defiance, quiet, principled, imperfect, shaped everything he built. In a world obsessed with growth at all costs, Chouinard chose something different. He showed that it's possible to build with the grain of your values. That business, when guided by purpose and humility, doesn't have to be a contradiction. It can be an offering. Sometimes the greatest success is not what you hold on to, but what you're willing to let go.